Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Policy Pathways to Mass Timber for Michigan webinar. This webinar is hosted by the Michigan Forest Biomaterials Institute, MIFB, and MassTimber at MSU. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Sandra Lupien. I am the director of the MassTimber at MSU program. MassTimber at MSU mobilizes education, science, outreach, and communication to advance mass timber construction and manufacture in Michigan and the surrounding region. It's a partnership between the Department of Forestry, the School of Planning, Design, and Construction, and the Michigan State University Extension. So I'm very excited to be here with you today as your moderator. MassTimber at MSU co-hosts these webinars with the Michigan Forest Biomaterials Institute, MIFB, which fosters sustainable forests, communities, and responsible production, use, and recycling of forest biomaterials. They are conveners and educators. They're independent and nonprofit organization that's driven by volunteers. And MIFB began hosting these webinars coming out of the Michigan Mass Timber Summit in January of this year, and then MassTimber at MSU began co-hosting these with MIFB last month, which is a great pleasure, and we're very excited to be here doing that. Next slide here, we're going to talk a little bit about webinar logistics here. This is a Zoom webinar, so all of the attendees and participants are muted. Your cameras will be off for the duration of the webinar. And we're going to be using the question and answer function, which if you can see the cursor, I'm circling it down in the black bar at the bottom of my screen, Q&A. So if you have a question, type it in there. My friend Brian Craig at MIFB will be monitoring that Q&A box, and we'll come back to your questions closer to the end of the webinar, and we'll address as many as we can. I'm really pleased to share with you today that we have two very knowledgeable and insightful guests joining us to speak about their insights on mass timber. So let's see, Skip and Iain, you can turn on your cameras. Hi, gentlemen. Iain Macdonald, he's with Oregon State University and is the director of the Tall Wood Design Institute. That's an interdisciplinary research collaborative with University of Oregon to advance mass timber and other structural wood building solutions in that state. And we also have Skip Swenson. He's the Vice President of Policy and Programming at Forterra, which drives land-based solutions in Washington to support a healthy environment and resilient communities for all. And gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's early on the Pacific Coast, earlier than it is in Michigan, and we really appreciate you being here today to share your insights. And we'll hear from Skip and Iain in just a few moments. I'm gonna take a minute here to kind of frame our topic today, what we're all doing here. So I want to first start by sharing that earlier this month, Michigan State University celebrated the grand opening of the first mass timber building in Michigan, the STEM Teaching and Learning Facility. And there you can see the facade from the outside. From the outside, you can't really tell it's a mass timber building. You see a lot of glass, you see some brick cladding, but inside is where the magic happens. This is the first education, classroom, and laboratory building that Michigan State has built in more than 50 years. And they really wanted it to be this centralized hub for core STEM education courses at the university, a place where new students, mostly freshmen, sophomores, can gather for their core STEM curriculum with state-of-the-art wet and dry laboratories, lots of collaboration space, classrooms, a big cafe, all kinds of wonderful features. This is an adaptive reuse. They built it on the site of MSU's last coal burning power plant and did some amazing things to build around that, and built about 120,000 square feet of new building. And that is composed of a mass timber and steel hybrid structural system. So just a few pictures here of that building. You can see some collaboration spaces there. You can see how the mass timber is integrated with steel. It's a very beautiful, spacious, airy building with a warm feel of timber integrated with kind of that industrial feel of the steel. We're excited about this building. It's received significant funding from the state of Michigan in order to be built. And this building is sparking more interest in mass timber statewide for its ability to result in these beautiful, strong buildings that you can often build faster, often build cheaper, while uniting forests, the benefits of forest, with carbon storage benefits in the built environment to really realize powerful climate and sustainability benefits. So we're really excited about the STEM facility on the MSU campus. And although MassTimber has been in use for several decades in Europe, it's still pretty new in the United States, as you know, but interest is growing. We've seen more than 1,160 MassTimber buildings in design or construction across all 50 US states. That's according to data from our friends at Woodworks. But mainstreaming new technologies and systems usually requires removing a lot of barriers, right? So in the case of MassTimber in Michigan, those barriers are going to arise for the architects, engineers, construction stakeholders, as well as building owners who seek to build with MassTimber. And barriers are also going to arise for those who seek to manufacture MassTimber in Michigan. But we know we can get ahead of these barriers now by thinking about how thoughtful, targeted policies can help create pathways for MassTimber construction and eventually for MassTimber manufacture in Michigan. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so we can have a conversation. And the start to the kicking off the conversation with our guests is just that, you know, the Pacific Northwest in Oregon and Washington. I just realized I have my camera off. Hello, I'm Sandra. The Pacific Northwest in Oregon and Washington State, they caught the MassTimber bug about a decade ago. And they've really been leading the charge in the United States, grappling with and addressing some key barriers through a variety of policy interventions, as well as collaborations and leadership actions. So our two guests are MassTimber champions in the Pacific Northwest who are joining us today to share their key insights from those states. So I've already shared kind of the brief credential introductions of these gentlemen, and I would just like for each of you, Skip and Iain, to start by sharing a bit about yourselves and at a high level, how you and your organizations have been involved in the MassTimber landscape in your states. So Skip Swenson, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation this morning. I appreciate the opportunity. So I'm Skip Swenson, and as you mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Policy and Programming at Forterra, which is, it's an unconventional land trust. So in addition to conserving land, we work as a nonprofit organization on community programming, community development, within that rural economic development, and just largely looking at cross-landscape solutions for how we address some really pressing problems that we all face. Climate change out here in the Pacific Northwest, population growth, social inequities. How do these things all come together? And we first saw in 2014 this new construction type that was, we first saw it through Canada and then realized Oregon was working on it, as were a number of others. And then it seemed like this really interesting opportunity that Washington would be well positioned for. We started talking around. There's definitely some leaders here in Washington that were really far ahead. So a number of architects, number of academic researchers, but we really didn't have any central organizing force. There was no consistency in terms of who was looking at what priorities ought we have, how can we position Washington, which is a wood producing state, has a history of production as well as design, and a lot of expertise. Like, how can we bring that forward in a way that could really help Washington not only just, I think, get a market established here, but also how could we steer towards some really good outcomes, which I'm happy to talk about later. But that's ultimately where we started. And Forterra, as an organization that gets involved in a lot of creative solutions to address those issues that I mentioned, we felt like we could get at least in the center of that and organize perhaps a successful, coalition moving forward. And that's what we were able to do. Oh, I can't hear you, Sandra.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And we're going to learn a lot more about that coalition as this conversation progresses. So very excited about that. And then Iain, same question for you. If you could share a bit about yourself and how your organization, Tallwood Design Institute, as well as your university, has been involved in the MassTimber landscape in Oregon.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, so I mean, I came to Oregon 5 years ago, and previous to that, I was in British Columbia for about 20 years. And for most of that time, I was working in or with the wood products industry. I worked at the University of British Columbia at an organization called the Center for Advanced Wood Processing. And we got involved with MassTimber around 2009, 2010, just before the Vancouver Whistler Winter Olympics, when the province was trying to showcase wood on the world stage. Since that time, we worked more and more on the structural wood side of things. And then I came to Oregon as things were beginning in 2016. And by that point, things had already got started. Our institute is a collaboration between two universities, Oregon State University, colleges of engineering and forestry, and the University of Oregon's design school, predominantly the architecture department. So our goal is to kind of work holistically on applied research, applied education, and other kinds of support that we can provide to the sector. And we define the sector quite broadly, from manufacturing through design, engineering, and construction. So we really try to partner with a wide range of stakeholders. And I can talk more about the history of our organization as we get into this.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to hear a lot about collaboration during our conversation. That seems to be a key. So let's dive in. Iain, based on your understanding of the history, when and why did MassTimber bubble up in Oregon? Who were the initial champions and what interests did they represent?
So I think, the first kind of legislative action was in 2012, and that was an executive order that Governor Kitzhaber put into effect. I hope you can't hear my dog barking in the other room. That was to kind of generally to promote wood products as a green building material and encourage innovative uses of wood products. So it's kind of a recognition that the MassTimber wave was coming. The first buildings that were constructed in Oregon were mostly designers, and the practitioners were coming down from British Columbia. That there was kind of that trickle down effect, and then our own designers and engineers and contractors started to gain their own in-house capacity to do these kinds of things. So 2012 was kind of the first thing. I do want to call out our former dean of the College of Forestry at OSU, Thomas Mannis. He was really a pivotal figure in Oregon in kind of getting both the public and the private sector interested in the opportunity that was MassTimber. And he was very interested. He came from he had a wood science type background, working from Weyerhaeuser for many years. And then he also had a forest management specialization. That was his kind of academic specialty. And so he saw things from quite a holistic perspective. And he was trying to craft, he came down to Oregon as a department head from UBC actually, and then became dean. And as dean, he was trying to craft a sort of vision of how the future College of Forestry could reflect this kind of holistic vision that he had. And he saw MassTimber as a way to do that, because you can kind of unite these sustainability goals that a lot of forest management and forest conservation professionals have with the the kind of commercial interests in using the fiber from the forests for products, buildings, and other things. So this what he thought was the perfect vehicle to kind of enact this vision. And so he catalyzed discussions with industry and government that resulted in several things. In 2015, our own Tallwood Design Institute was funded with funds from the state legislature, and that's continued ever since, fortunately, and that's why I have a job. And then, there were studies done with funds from Economic Development Agency looking at accelerating CLT adoption in Oregon and Southwest Washington. And then that led to various other things. In 2015, D.R. Johnson became the first certified manufacturer of cross-laminated timber for structural applications in the United States. And things kind of went from there. The next year, the first MassTimber conference was held in Portland. And meanwhile, a lot of things were happening immediately north in Washington state as well.
That's wonderful. And when did you see your first building?
I believe it was 2015. There was actually a small structure that was built at the zoo. That was an elephant house, I believe. And it was the first use of CLT in Oregon, I believe. And that was actually done by a designer who then went to work for Path Architecture, who built Carbon 12, which for many years was the largest wood building in the United States. Eclipsed, I think, already by the 25-story building in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But yeah, actually, if you want to bring up the first image in my deck, that shows Albina Yard, which was thanks, yeah, little 4-story building. That's the that is actually the now the offices of Lever Architecture, who are one of the foremost architects in MassTimber in this state. But that building went up in 2015. And then the following year, I think if you go to the next slide, well, we can talk about this one. This one was kind of pivotal for Oregon. This is the Framework Building. It's a 12-story building designed by Lever Architecture. Was the winner of the USDA and the USDA Tallwood Building Prize in 2015. There was a prize. The prize was kind of split between this building in Portland and another building in New York. And the kind of sad thing is this never got built. Ultimately, there were budgetary shortfalls, and they couldn't make it work from a economic point of view. But what was the sort of legacy from this building was a whole bunch of research that was done on the structural systems and other aspects, the fire protection systems, and those kind of lived on, so the data from those tests went into the open source, into the public domain, and they then became, they were enablers for companies to then go and get other MassTimber building designs permitted in the state, which kind of catalyzed a lot of the activity that you see today. And in 2016, in the next slide, the next 3 slides, if you just want to kind of page through them, those show Carbon 12. And that was built by this, as I said, Path Architecture. It's kind of a high-end upscale condominium project. Beautiful use of timber throughout. And that was, that really kind of put Oregon on the stage as far as MassTimber.
And I've been in this building and also the offices of Lever Architects, and both are just really, really gorgeous. I remember going into Carbon 12 a few years ago and thinking, yeah, I would live here. I would love to live in this beautiful building. What a great feel. So yeah, thank you for kind of taking us from the energy, getting excited around the idea, to kind of the first early advocates and champions of MassTimber to projects on the ground. I think it's just really exciting to see that cycle. So let's now go to Skip. And Skip, same question for you. How did it all get started in Washington? When did it start bubbling? Who were the early champions? And how did it start rolling out? You touched on it a little in your intro, but let's go.
I did. So I mentioned there's a number of people that were industry specific, looking at MassTimber and doing some really interesting work. So architects like Susan Jones and Joe Mayo are a couple of examples. Academic researchers, Washington State University had a number of folks that were working on material science and engineering around MassTimber and still continue to do so and be important there. University of Washington was doing a lot of interesting early work on markets and market adoption, what that could look like, what the opportunities might be. But as I mentioned, while there's a lot of individual actors that were doing important work, they hadn't necessarily come together. And so one of the things that we were able to do early on was have an event where we had sort of a purposeful invitation for 80 different folks over 2 days to come together and say, is there something here? If yes, what is it, and what's it going to take for us to catalyze the MassTimber market? And These were folks from the wood products industry, academics, elected officials, agency officials, architects, construction, environmental organizations, just the whole host of actors that might have an interest and something to contribute to the conversation. We just tried to make sure folks were represented across the board so that we could think comprehensively about what we were going to do. Coming out of that first meeting, which I think was early 2015, we said, we think there's something here. We think Washington can be a leader. We think that the market is going to establish, but we should try and make it happen a little bit more quickly and maybe steer us towards some good public policy outcomes, public affairs outcomes as well. And then had a strategy at least roughed out, which had 6 different pillars. And it was how we incentivize tall wood design and construction, production, codes, education, workforce development, and then sourcing a sustainable supply. And what do all those things look like in need? That's what came later. And with the help of a Wood Innovation Grant from the Forest Service and later support from our State Department of Commerce, we were able to bring together this coalition that I mentioned before, which did a variety of things. And so we were able to pass some important, I think you want to get to it later, so I'll hold on it. But so I think some, not a lot, but some key legislative measures that helped, but a lot of it was information provision, bringing people together, trying to share what knowledge is there, identify what gaps exist, how we can fill those, and just largely create a strategy to bring us forward as a state and provide some policy support while the market actors themselves were really doing a lot of the on-the-ground work to make it happen. So that in a nutshell is what we were doing here. And along the way, there was, I think, some interesting projects that came through. The earliest project was actually a house, a residential house that Susan Jones built to demonstrate what's possible here in the city of Seattle. We had some early use of CLT in a building in Shoreline, Washington, which is just north of the Seattle area, if you're not familiar. And then from there, it's really moved. I don't have current data, but I was looking at Woodworks count from last March. And we had in Washington, I think it was 34 projects in construction or completion, and then another 24 in design. So things are starting to take off here. I think we had some success, but there's of course a long ways to go, but it's very promising so far.
Yeah, that's inspiring progress, and nice to understand again that kind of the trajectory from when people started thinking about it to where they are now. So the next thing I'd love to talk about is just start really talking about some of those barriers. We're really here to talk about barriers to mass timber adoption as well as manufacture. I really want to focus on adoption first. So really thinking about the key barriers to getting mass timber into buildings. And Iain, I'll start with you there. So what did you see there? What barriers were you seeing? And then if you can begin outlining some of the policy actions, whether those are executive, legislative, administrative, that Oregon has taken to mitigate some of those barriers to actually building with mass timber. We'd love to hear those and a little bit more about the impact of those.
Sure. I mean, the barriers are, I think, common to most states, in the form of, first of all, lack of knowledge in mass timber building systems themselves among everyone, designers, engineers, contractors, permitting officials, public sector officials. So, Woodworks has been doing great work for years in the US and Canada on that, really trying to change, and I think we've seen progress now in that, the conversation used to be why build with wood. And now it's, how to build with wood, or how to build cost effectively with wood. So the conversation's kind of morphed over the time. Our institute does have a mandate to do outreach, and what we try to do, because we generate a lot of research outputs, is to try to put that data into the hands of people that can use it as quickly as possible. So it's not sequestering the research results away in these arcane journals that nobody might read, or have access to, or they're, subscription only. But trying to turn that into information that's put in layman's terms and then put out to people through various methods, So that's been really key. We started industry networking forum called Critical Mass Timber as a meetup group 3 years ago. Now we have 800 members, and it's a very casual once a month thing. I mean, lately, of course, it's moved virtual, which is a little bit less fun because we used to get together and have some beer and wine and some cheese and crackers and, just physically mingle and network. But now it's all done via Zoom, at least for the foreseeable future. But so as I say, I think the biggest barrier is awareness and competence and confidence in using those systems. There are, of course, these large elephants in the room, I guess, like what happens in a fire, what happens in an earthquake, what happens when, you're constructing a building in the Pacific Northwest and it rains all winter during the construction. These are things we have really good answers to, but and the research is generating more nuanced answers all the time, but we people are not aware of those things. So that's been the first challenge. And then there's the sort of economics of it, the perception that mass timber buildings are more expensive than conventional construction, which is true in some cases, but not all cases. So that's also partly education, and it's also doing research to develop standardized systems, and not recreating the wheel every time you design one of these buildings, which, some architects like to do that because, they want to make a statement. Wood's a beautiful material. You can really do dramatic, iconic things. But if you try and do that every single time, then you end up with systems that are not very cost efficient. So, we need to get to the point where we are, first of all, there are tested and proven ways of designing these things, the connector systems, the acoustic separation, the fire strategies, all of those things. And so, as more of these buildings get built, that's definitely going to happen organically. But, we and other organizations are trying to sort of push that along. In terms of permitting, Oregon was fortunate in that the state has the ability to step in when an individual municipality feels like they don't have the confidence or the expertise to evaluate a mass timber permit by themselves. So in some of the early buildings, that was the case. I think you mentioned when we were discussing before that Carbon 12 was one of those examples. I actually am quite familiar with the design team there, and they said that basically what happened with that was the state began the process of reviewing permits, doing inspections, because the city of Portland was a little bit unsure about how to treat these things. But about midway through, the city did take over and they actually granted the final permit. So there was kind of this evolution. And city of Portland has now become very good at and has a lot of comfort with mass timber. I will say as well that Oregon and Washington were the first two states to adopt the tall wood building ICC code provisions that came in late 2019. I think we can't quite be sure who was first. I think we announced first, but then we're implementing a week later or something. And but that's been enormously helpful as well, to have a very forward-thinking building codes department.
If I may, I just want to kind of put a little bit more of an anchor in that and what that is. So the International Code Council is the international body that creates and adopts building codes. That's the International Building Code, IBC. And in 2019, that body adopted new codes that included 14 new elements related to mass timber building. And so that allows different types of mass timber building, different ways of building with mass timber, and kind of like the star of the show is being able to build up to 18 stories with mass timber as a structural system. So those went into effect in 2021. And so Oregon and Washington's those states and several others as well made the decision to early adopt those codes into their own codes ahead of those states' normal code adoption cycles, so that they're like, we want to be able to use these, we're going to adopt them now, and here we go. So that's kind of that context.
Right. And other barriers, obviously there's capital cost to establishing manufacturing operations for cross-laminated timber and other products. So the state did help in and provide some support to D.R. Johnson when they added CLT to their manufacturing operations. And I think, just generally we're fortunate in the Pacific Northwest. I think, BC, Washington, and Oregon are similar in that they have the timber industry is a huge part of the local economy and has been for a century or more. So the local, certainly in Oregon, the state's legislature has been very most legislators have been very keen to support the timber industry, and we've had this decline in harvesting because of conservation. Necessary conservation methods put in place in the late 90s. So there were, rural jobs lost there due to mill closures. So MassTimber was seen as a way to redress that balance, bring well-paying jobs back to rural communities. So there was a great willingness, I think, among our public officials to support MassTimber, especially because of the sustainability benefits, with the caveat, of course, that the fiber has to come from sustainably managed forests.
Very important point to make. Thank you. And Skip, same for you. In Washington, in terms of the demand side of this equation, what were the barriers you were seeing to get MassTimber in buildings? And were there any interventions that the state of Oregon made or other policy entities were able to make to help move things along a bit?
Yeah, sure. So it's a lot of the same issues that Iain mentioned. It's, I think first and foremost was information and just trying to get, I think, just basic understanding what's possible, not even knowing what the limitations were because we weren't sure what the opportunities were. And so just working through an education aspect to it, I think was a significant piece. Another one was codes, and you mentioned that, and I can speak more to both of those. I think the other two, and I heard this a bit in what Iain said, but just to call it out specifically, I think is coordination amongst others. I did mention the coalition, and I do think that continues to be an important piece. We, for example, not only do we have like regular panels and annual meetings, but we also have now every other month a call, but for a while we were doing it weekly, a call just statewide. Anybody can call in, and it was a round table on what's going on, what's happening, what information do you have, who can I talk to about this? Very casual, but also just a really effective way of keeping people engaged and getting information exchanged pretty quickly. So, and then the last piece is just experience. And that's the one that we continue to find all the new things that we hadn't realized that we didn't know. So amongst those four things, we had various strategies. A lot of the policy, however, focused around, I think, the information exchange and the codes. And so probably the first place that we started, and I actually shared some photos of this, if you want to pull those up, is in 2016, a number of elected officials, both at the federal level and the state level, became quite excited about the possibility and education and provision and making sure that we have adequate facilities for our education system was paramount, particularly in 2016. So it was just a happy marriage between expanding classroom capacity and showcasing the opportunities that MassTimber might have. So there was 5.5 million that went to 5 projects from various parts of the state, different communities, to bring MassTimber classroom expansion to life. And so you can see the kids there. And small projects ultimately, but it did what I think it really set out to do, is not only show what's possible in the future for how we might consider expanding our capacities for our educational system, but it got a lot of people excited about the potential of using Washington wood in mass timber buildings here in Washington, Washington labor, and just revitalizing a lot of the opportunity, revitalizing the communities, excuse me, that Iain mentioned, that are historically timber dependent, are looking for new market opportunities, just showing what's possible. And so while 5.5 is somewhat modest in terms of capital investment, it had an outsized impact on, I think, moving us forward as a state to try and support this new industry. So beyond that, it really then came down to codes as being our next primary area of focus. And that was really for two reasons. One was the architects were saying, obviously, that's what we need to do if we want to move forward with meeting the potential for these sets of new products. And the producers were saying the same. They were saying, if you could prove up demand, that's what we need to move forward with the investments that we need to make to bring production here to Washington. So codes became very important for us, and we did have folks within our coalition that were operating within the federal process. And so we had a good line there in terms of, here's the timing, here's the steps that are occurring, here's when we think we could start thinking about bringing this to Washington in a way that's responsible. Ultimately, there was an action by the state legislature that said, State Building Codes Council, we'd like for you to explore the possibility of using this. And then we worked with some individuals, but in particular, the American Institute of Architects Washington chapter, to bring forward a proposal to the State Building Codes Council that mulled this over, really looked at it, and to their credit, as Iain says, I think took a leadership role in saying, we feel confident we can move forward with these improvements to our code in advance of the International Building Code 2021 coming out. So that became a very important piece for us to move forward. I think it crystallized what we're trying to do as a state. And then there was one final piece, I would say, that was important for production. I don't know that it was critical, but it definitely was supportive. We have our primary business tax here is the B&O tax, the business and occupation tax. It has some standard rates. It has some exempted services that has what they call preferential rates, and timber products were included in the preferential tax rates for businesses. But when they wrote that code, they didn't conceive of mass timber being something. So we were able to just ensure that that the preferential rate was extended to mass timber in our state, which was a boon for production. And ultimately, we've had two producers established here. One, unfortunately, closed its doors after it ran into some issues with its financing. But we do have another upcoming in the town of Darrington is building a campus for a new production facility that should come online in the next couple of years. So that's exciting.
Yeah, those are all very exciting developments. And I think I'm hoping for our audiences here, it's really helpful to hear about interventions like that B&O preference. I think that's quite innovative and really, probably hard won, but maybe not that difficult to implement, So I think hearing of those things is very helpful. And before we get to our questions, you'll each have a chance to run through a slide where you've shared kind of like the key policy interventions over the past X years, so that we can just really kind of get everybody thinking on the same and get everybody on the same page about what has happened. I think it's great. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about something that I think these are open questions that come up in every conversation that I have about mass timber. And, because the forest health, the carbon storage, the climate solutions are such a key part of the conversation and the value of building with mass timber and of manufacturing mass timber. I just want to talk a little bit, and Iain, you agreed to say a few words about this, about how well we understand carbon life cycle of mass timber products, and where do we have strong insight, and what do we need to learn still in order to craft sound policies, sound policies from a climate and sustainability solution perspective related to mass timber?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, the answer is we're learning all the time. but we can be comfortable that wood as the only major renewable building material has a distinct advantage over materials with much higher embodied energy like concrete and steel. Now that that's part of a total life cycle picture for any building project. If you source these renewable materials from halfway around the world and have to add the transportation carbon footprint, then it becomes less compelling. In some cases it can be better to use some light frame steel rather than some mass timber from Europe. But generally, if you're comparing from similar regions, domestic supply, we can be comfortable that wood is the best environmental solution, provided, as you say, that it comes from a sustainably managed source. Now we're fortunate in the US and Canada that we have very good forest management practices. There's a lot of confusion created around should we use a certified timber certified from a third-party certification system like FSC. And I think that's a very nuanced conversation, because you're really getting into the weeds about how those forest management practices take place. But certainly Oregon made efforts several years ago to try to demonstrate that its forest management practices were responsible and world class. But there are some differences in the sizes of clear cuts allowed and the proximity to streams and wildlife protections and that kind of thing. So you can really delve down into that. But I think we're learning all the time. There are competing perspectives out there. Even in our own university, we'll have forest biologists who will be appraising this whole, how sustainable is mass timber from a different perspective, a different lens than someone who's maybe in the business of doing building life cycle analysis, in terms of the assumptions they make about the lifespan of the building and things like the substitution effect. So if you don't harvest the timber in the United States, then this could, somewhere timber is going to be harvested, and likely in a jurisdiction where it might be less subjected to less rigor in terms of its oversight of the forest management practices. So it's a very nuanced conversation. We have a project going on right now at University of Oregon it's called Carbon Narratives for Design Planning, and it's really looking at all of these competing narratives and trying to reconcile those and come up with sort of an overarching set of guidelines that everybody can agree to.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think that speaks to one place where governments can support and kind of take action to advance mass timber construction and manufacturers with funding for ongoing research of things like open questions around life cycle analysis. I know one thing we talk about at MSU a lot is questions around end of life options for mass timber, right? And I know those questions are still quite open.
I'd like to add just one thing on that,
Please.
Which is, I think Iain covered it quite well. There's definitely a lot of questions going on. One place I wanted to plug is the Carbon Leadership Forum, which is run through the University of Washington. It's a host for a lot of information, but it's also an area that is a central repository for research that's coming through and ongoing. And I think a lot of the questions that Iain mentioned are being explored right now. One area that they didn't mention, but I'd also like to say here in Washington, as in other places, we have significant issues around forest health and public lands due to overstocking for some of the reasons that Iain mentioned. And there's also, I think, some that are looking into, can we find markets for some of the wood that comes through from the thinning that we need to have for wildfire management? That's not been an easy an easy option to pursue, and MassTimber has the potential to serve smaller diameter trees going into high quality wood panels. More research has to be done there as well. It's not directly on the carbon piece, but it's definitely connected to climate change. So I thought I'd mention that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. The Carbon Leadership Forum is full of wonderful research, and I certainly visit their resources frequently. It's very useful, very, very useful. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to give you each an opportunity to just kind of summarize those key policy and leadership interventions that have really helped advance MassTimber in your states. I'm going to share the slides that we created together for this purpose. And then Skip, I think you're first. So actually that might not be true. Nope. Yes, you are first. One moment, please.
Yeah.
All right. It keeps not cooperating with me. I tell it to go from the current slide, but it won't do it. Here we go. Haha. All right, Skip. So
Okay.
Thinking about, yeah, what's Washington done? And let's just share all these insights with folks so that they can have them top of mind as they start moving toward closing this webinar.
Sure. So I mentioned some of these, but it's essentially at the state level, a combination of investments and supportive policy. And so I mentioned the investments for the classroom expansions. There's been a number of occasions where there's been support for research, either for general market research, as going through Department of Commerce by way of example, to support producers that may be interested in the potential. And we've done, this complements some of the work that Forterra and others had done to try and evaluate what the market potential would be through a demand study. We had the B&O tax preference that I mentioned, some of this other study. And then right towards the end, most recently, the University of Washington Tacoma is building a new large facility on its campus. And this is towards the end here. It is going to be looking at what we were just talking about, the EPDs, and also the working conditions for the building once it's constructed. And so again, this is just the state trying to demonstrate and support the investments in early iconic projects that will produce information, hopefully, that will support the market broadly. And then at the federal level, you mentioned here that it's Senator Stabenow's Timber Innovation Act. The House equivalent was, I just want to note, Representative Susan Del Bene, Derek Kilmer, and other members of Washington's delegation and others that supported what ultimately became the Timber Innovation Act, which is a really helpful guide for how we have technical assistance as well as continuing grant funds coming from the state to support research into answering the questions that we've identified here and others.
Thank you. And yes, I had to call out Senator Stabenow, of course, because this is a Michigan webinar.
Yeah, I know.
Credit to the representatives as well for taking on that important bill. Thank you very much for that, Skip. Let's go to Oregon. So can you see this whole screen, or is there like a little black box over part of it?
No, I can see it. Thank you.
Perfect. Great. Take it away, Iain.
Yeah, so I covered some of these things. I talked about the executive order, about Dean Manis's leadership, and D.R. Johnson coming along as the first certified manufacturer. TDI was established in 2015 with a biennial contribution of about $2.5 million. That's grown to about 3.75 now, a little bit higher maybe. There were studies done of feasibility of establishing manufacturing operations. The Tallwood Building Prize, as I mentioned, was a really key one. The MassTimber Conference, it's now become the International MassTimber Conference, is a huge event, and we've been fortunate that that's continued to be located here in Portland. And so that's really kind of grown the buzz and consolidated the community. I think that, and then we have Carbon 12. It's interesting that even though this USDA Tallwood Building prize-winning building didn't happen, so many privately funded buildings have have occurred. One actually that's not on this list that I like to call out is First Tech Credit Union, which was a 5-story building that was completed in, I think, 2017 or 2018. And it was really interesting because it was the first time that the contractor had built a mass timber building, and they managed to save 5% over the cost of building an equivalent steel building. And I think that really changed the conversation in that, first of all, we realized, well, these things can be done without subsidies per se, or government support. And also, they can be cost competitive. So, this kind of like enduring thought that it always has to be more expensive is simply not the case anymore. I talked about the Tallwood building code provisions, and so did Skip. When one of the things that Oregon is trying to do now is sort of build on the first mover advantage per se that we've been lucky enough to have in terms of holding a summit to look at where do we go next. And we have a whole cluster strategy in the works now starting to look at things like modular housing. And I know that's there's Methuen in Washington that's doing great things there as well. But how do we address challenges like affordable housing with mass timber? What's the sweet spot for that? It's really design dependent because you're using more materials. So you have to be really, really savvy on the design side and the manufacturing side and efficient. So I think, we continue to look at this industry as a key part of the Oregon economy. And, another thing that was in this list, in retrospect was the state did provide bonds to fund a sizable component of several buildings. One was the PV Forest Sciences Center on our own campus, which is our new College of Forestry building, and part of the lab behind me, which is our new testing and fabrication lab, and other buildings at University of Oregon and in our campus in the Cascades. So that was also really, really important.
Excellent. Thank you both for sharing those lists of interventions and actions from Oregon and Washington. I think, we're kind of at an earlier stage here in Michigan, and it's very inspiring and helpful to see, how much of a difference certain actions can really make, even some relatively small ones. I mean, Skip, you mentioned the investment in the schools in Washington. 5.5 million is not a huge amount of capital. However, it offers a great opportunity to get the material in a building where people can see it, to demonstrate its use in a particular context, and then to tell a great story, and I think that's something that we're going to see as being really important in Michigan moving forward. We're already seeing that with our STEM facility, but as more buildings, rise from the ground, we're going to have more stories to tell. Iain, you mentioned the International Mass Timber Conference in Oregon, in Portland, which is in April. I'm happy that I'm going to be returning to it this year, hopefully, if COVID cooperates with us all. And for Michigan folks, I'd be very interested in organizing a contingent to join that conference this year. So we can participate in all of the wonderful programs and also in the tours of all of the buildings in the Portland area, because you can see mass timber used in a variety of different types of buildings. And it's really exciting to see it in something as small as a single family home all the way up to the very large credit union that Iain mentioned, which I was able to see under construction a few years ago. I think we're getting very close to our time. I have one question, which is, as Michigan, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, as Michigan kind of, starts moving into this mass timber space more and more, you both mentioned actions that your states took, industry meetups, working on codes, architects kind of pushing the envelope. What if you were going to do it again? What are the key threads you would pull first?
I'd be happy to start since Iain's on mute still. Honestly, I think I would do it very similarly for how we did. We had the benefit of learning from what Oregon was doing. And it was important for us to bring everybody into the room, because there are differing opinions as to how supportive this is of housing, how supportive of this is going to be for environmental resilience. So having the discussions up front, sometimes hard discussions up front in an open forum with an open mind, was really important for us to find ways to move forward as a coalition with partners that in other forums maybe see things very differently. And so, yeah, for me, that was just what's critical. And I think then targeted intervention at the policy level, a lot of education, and just opportunities for collaboration. Maybe we would do it differently in terms of execution, but I think in terms of the model, it was really effective. And I think it's helped us get to where we're at.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. Iain, in just a couple seconds, any key threads you would pull?
Yeah, and I think Skip said it really well. I really agree with him about the importance of having a vehicle for consultation and collaboration. And in our case, it was done a little bit more organically through this kind of one guy who really was a champion. And in Skip's case, that Forterra were really like the kind of anchor of that. But I think, yeah, you need to convince the key, policymakers that this is the right thing to do. And, fortunately, we have really good things to say. We desperately need to reduce wildfire risk, in our forests. We need to address housing affordability in a lot of our cities. We need to drive down our carbon footprint. And we need to create urban and rural jobs. So there are really good news stories to be told that appeal to both sides of the political aisle, which I think has been a real benefit in that, in trying to advance this. And it's been, in Oregon, is my experience, and in Oregon, it was refreshing how, policymakers, public officials really embraced this and really wanted to know about it. So I think creating that buzz and energy is really, really important. And then just really moving on with, some quick wins would be a great strategy.
Great. That's a great way to close the discussion portion of this webinar. Thank you so much, Iain Macdonald of the Tallwood Design Institute and Oregon State University, Skip Swenson of Forterra. We're so grateful for your insights today. And before we close the webinar, I have a few upcoming webinar and other types of opportunities to share. So let me quickly get back to sharing my screen, which I did not just do. One moment, please. All right, here we go. So we've got coming up the next MassTimber webinar that MassTimber at MSU and MIFB are running is on October 14th, New Challenges in MassTimber Construction. That's going to be an exciting one, so you can register for that. I'm going to drop the links into the chat once more before we close this call today. The next webinar I want you to know about is on October 6th. This is a conversation with Jeff Spiritos, a key leader in MassTimber in North America, affordable housing opportunities with MassTimber. This is hosted by the MSU School of Planning, Design, and Construction. Really looking forward to that one. And then one more opportunity that I don't have a slide for, but my colleague George Berghorn at MSU is conducting a survey of architecture, engineering, and construction industry academics. So people who work on those subject matter in academia. There's a survey to develop post-secondary curriculum to help those industries adopt MassTimber construction. So I'm just going to post all three of these links into the chat right now for the two webinars and for the survey. So please grab those before you go and plan to join us for those. With that, I think it is time for us to close our webinar. But again, we're so grateful to our guests today and to all of you who attended. We've recorded the webinar and we'll share it with all registered attendees so that you can share it and review all of these wonderful policy insights from Oregon and Washington. And thank you so much for attending. We'll see you next time.